We're just going to wait a couple minutes for the attendees to come in, and then we'll start shortly. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Saipan, and I'm the director of GEL, which is Global Experiential Learning here at the University of Arizona. And thank you again for joining us for our last session in September, our Global Conversation session. And we invite you to travel with us to South Africa, where we're going to have a special presentation by Mr. Lionel Davis, who was a former prisoner of Robben Island, and we're going to get to teach you a little bit more about that today. So I'm going to turn it over to the Africa EDU team.
Thank you so much, Dan. A very warm virtual welcome to you all from Cape Town, South Africa, where it is currently 7 o'clock in the evening. My name is Risa Khomlope, and I will be your facilitator for this session on behalf of EDU Africa. EDU Africa is a study abroad program provider in Southern and East Africa, and we believe in the fundamentally in the power of connecting disciplines, histories, stories, and skills in a powerful movement for student transformation and positive global change. Today, we are excited to introduce you to Mr. Lionel Davis, who will be sharing about his life as a political activist and a prisoner on Robben Island during South Africa's apartheid era. In order to better frame this conversation with Mr. Lionel Davis, we will also be giving you a little bit of an introduction to South African history to lay a little bit of context. Let's have a look at our session outline. South Africa has a very rich and complex history that is impossible to cover within 30 minutes or even within an hour, but we'd like you to become a little bit more familiar with our historical context. So we will be touching on some key historical events and giving some significant information that will help frame social justice and racial inequality in South Africa today for you all. We'll start by looking at our geographical location so you all understand where South Africa is and where Cape Town is. We'll then cover some key terms and concepts in South Africa's history and culture that will be important for you all to understand throughout the session. We'll then have a brief overview of South African history, touching a little bit on our cultural diversity and the origins thereof, and then touching a little bit on our apartheid history as well. We'll then share a short video introduction to Robben Island Prison before handing over to Mr. Lionel Davis, who will share his story and speak on Black Lives Matter in a South African context. We'll then open the floor up to some questions and answers, and we do encourage you to make use of the Q&A tool to ask any questions or share any meaningful questions and comments throughout the session that will then be moderated and fielded to Mr. Lionel Davis. Let's have a look at where we are in the world. South Africa, as its name might suggest, is situated on the southernmost tip of the African continent. And within that country, in that space, on the southwesternmost tip is where you might find the Western Cape and where you'll find the city of Cape Town, which is, of course, one of the oldest colonial establishments in the country. And just off the coast of Cape Town, you will find Robben Island, which is a small island where Lionel was imprisoned for his political activity, amongst others. Let's have a look at our key terms and concepts that are important for you all to understand as we go on. So we'll start with apartheid, which is an Afrikaans word, apologies, an Afrikaans word meaning apartness, and it was a state-sanctioned system that was used to oppress and marginalize people of color. Then we have the term colored, which is a term that was a racial classification, rather, that was used to identify people of color that were not necessarily dark enough to be black, but not light enough to be white. And it was also used to further to further segregate people of color and limit the extent to which people of color would come together against the apartheid state. Then we have the word Afrikaner, which denotes white people who speak Afrikaans, which is of course derived from Dutch, which was imported to South Africa with the arrival of Dutch settlers. Then we have the word Bantu, which directly translated to English means people, and can be generalized to refer to black people or black sub-Saharan Africans who are of Bantu descent. And of course, Bantu can also be used to refer to a group of languages that also belong to the Niger-Congo language group. Then we have the word Ubuntu, which directly translated to English means to be a person. In South Africa, we use it to refer to humanity or personhood, and really captures the essence of shared community on the basis of humanity. Then a very popular term that we have is Rainbow Nation, which was originally coined by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and then popularized, of course, by our late former president, Nelson Mandela, used to describe the diversity of the peoples that are found in South Africa. Lastly, we have Born Frees, which is used to refer to the generation of kids who were born in 1994 in particular, but can also be generalized to refer to people who were born after 1994, and we use it because this generation was apparently born into freedom. Right. So we see that the Black Lives Matter movement, rather, has resurged in the United States of America and has found voice across the globe. And of course, we know that across the globe, wherever you may go, you're almost certain to find Black people and people of color who are suffering under oppression, under the thumb of white supremacy. And so it resonates across the globe. There are parallels that can be drawn between the Black Lives Matter movement as it exists today and Black consciousness in South Africa, which was fathered by Ubuntu Steve Biko in the 1960s and 1970s. And he was a very critical role player and leader in the anti-apartheid movement, working to conscientize the Black student population in South Africa to move against the apartheid government. He was, of course, assassinated in the 1970s. Please listen closely to the following video clip from a documentary called The People versus the Rainbow Nation by Lebogang Rasitaba, that highlights conversations that continue to find voice in South Africa, and highlights the political climate of the country at this time and in recent years, among students in particular. I must also just give a little bit of a warning that there will be some maybe triggering language used in the clip, so please be advised.
Okay, let me break it down for you. 350 years ago, white people arrived from Europe and systematically took over land from people who were living here. And created, ultimately, a state system that deprived those indigenous people of the right to their land, their wealth, their lives, their ownership of themselves.
181 years of slavery, which a lot of us don't talk about, or because we don't know it. South Africa had 181 years of slavery. Add to that 200 years of colonialism by the British, and then add to that 46 years of apartheid. And it's just so funny how we expect to get over everything in a slice of 22 years.
I always try to dramatize it for people I have arguments with about this. And I always say, imagine if somebody has been raping you for 400 years, consistently every day, and everything that you know in your life has been revolving around this rape and making sure that you are nothing. And then someone comes up and says, you know what, stop raping now. And you go, okay, fine, I'll stop raping. And then someone says, you okay?
Greedy fingers.
We talk about 94 as this momentous point in the country's history. A white elite hands over the reins to a black elite, right? But for the most part, we keep the structure of the thing. They were previously whites-only institutions, but you don't change the institution, you just add blacks. And that's really what we did in 94. We didn't change anything, really, we just kind of added blacks.
Right, so as you heard in the video clip, Dutch colonial settlers arrived in South Africa in 1652. However, that is not to say that South Africa did not have a history before the arrival of the Dutch, because of course there were peoples who lived here, indigenous people who inhabited the land, and these are known as the first people of Southern Africa, and they were the San and the Khoikhoi. The San, meaning people without cattle, which was named by the Khoikhoi because the Khoi actually had vast amount of cattle, and cattle is actually seen as a symbol of wealth in various African cultures. So we have the San and the Khoi who came into contact with each other centuries before Dutch colonial settlers arrived, and of course had conflicts of their own when the Khoi, who originated in the northern most parts of what is today known as Botswana, migrated towards southern Africa, where the San originated in the Cape. They of course inhabited the land centuries before the arrival of our Dutch settlers. There's a long and complex history of Khoi and San contact with Dutch and British colonial settlers. Much of it is defined by brutality, violence, enslavement, land dispossession, and genocide. Subsequently, the Khoi as well as the San make up a very small proportion of today's South African population. There were two distinct people groups, but they have now become known as one people group, the Khoi San, due to generations of erasure, genocide, and colonial destruction in general. However, having been the first people of the land, many people groups in South Africa and the rest of the world draw their lineage from both of these people groups, but predominantly from the San. Modern day South Africa's population is primarily comprised of Black people who make up more than 75% of the population, majority of this population being of Bantu heritage, the Bantu people having originated in and migrated from southern West Africa from the 2nd millennium BCE in waves of movements known as the Great Bantu Migrations. Bantu people established themselves in societies and communities decades before colonial contact with Dutch and British settlers. The Black Bantu population in South Africa in particular is further split into a number of people groups most easily identifiable by language groups, most prominently AmaZulu, AmaXhosa, Batswana, Basotho, AmaNdebele, AmaSwati, Matsonga, and Babenda. Here it is important to note, of course, that pre-colonial African societies did not necessarily identify themselves by language, but rather by family and familial affiliation, and that identifying by language is colonial in nature, but that is a conversation, of course, for another day. The diversity does not end there. We also have identification by racial classification. We have white people, we have colored people, we have Cape Malay people, we have people of Asiatic descent. We also have the largest Indian diasporan population in this country, and many immigrants from other African countries and elsewhere in the world also call South Africa home. To understand a little bit more of these racial classifications, we must, of course, look at our apartheid history.
On April 27, 1994, Nelson Mandela cast his vote in the first free and democratic elections in South Africa, marking the official end to racial oppression and apartheid rule. Apartheid, a term we've heard before, but what exactly is it? The word itself stems from the South African dialect of Dutch Afrikaans and literally means apartness. But for millions in South Africa, it held a much darker reality. It was a system put in place by the Afrikaner National Party in 1948, which allowed for lawful segregation using racial divides.
Will you intensify your present policy of racial segregation?
The policy of, what do you mean by intensify? Whether any further measures are to come, it's impossible for me to say at the moment. I do not know of any.
The policy governed South Africa for nearly 50 years, but racial segregation existed long before apartheid even began. In 1913, the government passed the Natives Land Act, limiting black African land ownership to 7% and restricting them from buying or occupying land except as employees of a white master. More than 3 decades later, the practice of systematic racial segregation was given the name apartheid and was extended under the government led by the National Party. The party's goal was to separate South Africa's white minority from its non-white majority, in addition to separating non-whites from each other. They did this by putting in place hundreds of race laws touching every aspect of life, preventing equal opportunities for basic human rights to people of color, including dictating where they could live, work, go to school, all based on their race. Interracial relationships and marriages were illegal, and perhaps most importantly, non-whites did not have a right to vote.
All these laws after 1948 had one purpose in mind, and that was to ensure that the 4 million whites in South Africa had all the resources, the wealth, the jobs, the mines concentrated in their hands.
The Race Classification Act put people in 4 different categories: white at the top, followed by Indian, colored or of mixed descent, and black at the bottom. And within those groups were subgroups, further segregating ethnic and tribal groups. A number of pseudoscientific tests were used to classify individuals suspected of not being European. For example, the pencil test. This involved putting a pencil in an individual's hair. If the pencil fell to the floor, they passed the test and were considered white. If it stayed put, they were considered colored. Black South Africans were forced to carry identification at all times known as a passbook. Resistance to apartheid laws came in the form of mostly non-violent political protests. Together, freedom fighters like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu, and Ahmed Kathrada started to play an important role for both the African and Indian National Congress parties. In 1952, they began a defiance campaign calling on people to purposely break apartheid laws in order to get arrested. People of color got onto white buses, used white toilets, and entered white areas. Their hope was that the high number of prisoners would cause the system to collapse. But it did not. Thousands ended up in jail. And in 1953, the Public Safety Act and Criminal Law Amendment Act were passed to impose even more severe penalties for demonstrating against the law. On March 21, 1960, a protest against the use of passbooks turned violent in the black township of Sharpeville when police opened fire on unarmed protesters, leaving nearly 70 dead and 180 wounded, including children. A state of emergency was declared nationwide, and opposition political parties, including the ANC, were banned, forcing many to move their fight underground.
There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
By 1964, most resistant leaders, including Mandela, were sentenced to life imprisonment following the infamous Rivonia trials, which drew international attention. Eventually, a tide of global pressures put the government in a difficult position.
The world was changing. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and that was a major movement. There was increased calls for the divestment of companies from South Africa. There was a global movement to boycott South Africa.
Coupled with unrest within the country and the continued armed struggle, negotiations began between the ANC and the National Party. Slowly, apartheid began to dismantle. In 1990, at the age of 71, Nelson Mandela was released from prison.
I stand here before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people.
Elections were held 4 years later, with the ANC winning 62% of the vote and Nelson Mandela becoming president. The people of South Africa won their country back, and apartheid was abolished.
Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another.
So we see that apartheid was a formal system of oppression motivated by scientific racism and white supremacy and implemented by the white Afrikaner state. It started in 1948, but was of course preceded by years of colonization and years of a period we can refer to as the foundations of apartheid. This was a period during which legislation like the Black Land Act of 1913 and the Natives Urban Areas Act of 1923 were introduced to limit Black political and economic participation and Black life in general, while systematically privileging white South Africans in both the political and economic sense. The infamous past laws, as seen in the video, are a great example of the continued systematization of Black exclusion from citizenship and humanity during the apartheid era. These laws were usually enforced using brute violence, even though until 1960, the anti-apartheid struggle had been largely peaceful. After the Sharpeville massacre, where more than 60 Black people were killed by the police while peacefully protesting past laws, leaders in the anti-apartheid movement pivoted towards armed struggle against the racist apartheid state. The year 1960 also marks the beginning of a period we can refer to as high apartheid or grand apartheid. As its name might suggest, it was the period of time where state violence against Black people and people of color, particularly those who were active against the apartheid state, was at its most brutal. A great example of this is the first day of the Soweto uprisings, which began on the 16th of June, 1976.
Soweto under fire. The country's largest township had a dark cloud hovering over it. June 16, 1976, presented a new form of resistance towards the Afrikaans language policy introduced under the Bantu education in 1953 under the then apartheid government. It was under Bantu education that the then apartheid government spent 644 rands on a white child's education as opposed to a mere 42 rands on a black child's education. It was such inequalities, coupled with the Afrikaans language being enforced on black students, that led to a revolt. On that fateful day of June the 16th, what was supposed to be a peaceful protest by black students against the Afrikaans language policy turned ugly. Police fired at thousands of protesting students, killing 176 of them and leaving thousands injured. It was such inequalities fought by the youth and political movements that paved the way to a new political dawn in South Africa.
High apartheid continued into the late 70s until apartheid started to see its decline in the late 80s. In 1990, the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania, as well as the United Democratic Front, and a plethora of other anti-apartheid organizations which had moved underground after being banned by the apartheid state were unbanned. Under the leadership of the ANC, South Africa went into negotiating the end of apartheid in a series of conventions known as the Convention for a Democratic South Africa 1 and 2, or CODESA 1 and CODESA 2. CODESA 1 collapsed in a stalemate, but CODESA 2 moved forward and was successful. Political prisoners were released. A new interim constitution was drafted and enacted in 1913, and the country held its first inclusive democratic election in 1994. The ANC was elected into power and Nelson Mandela ascended to the presidency to become the first Black president of the Republic of South Africa. Many people mark 1994 as the end of apartheid, the beginning of the Rainbow Nation, and the beginning of freedom and equality for all. However, fast forward 26 years into South Africa's democratic reality, and not much has changed for the lives of people of color. The work that was done during the period of transition from apartheid to democracy was key to the political emancipation of Black people and people of color, giving us the right to vote and access certain human rights. However, not much or not enough was done to repair the economic and psychological destruction that was wrought upon people of color by the white Afrikaner nationalist state. Not enough was done to bring justice for the land that was stolen by settler colonists, the multitudes of families that were displaced from their communities, the multitudes of people of color that were excluded from dignified, well-paying jobs, all the lives that were taken away by the state in the process, and a plethora of other atrocities committed during apartheid. Further to that, we did not undo the structures that were put in place to marginalize people of color. And so what we see today is a nation that is more equal in theory than it is in practice. This is why Black Lives Matter has found such strong a voice in South Africa, as well as other African countries that have similar colonial histories to ours. That is not to say, of course, that South Africa does not have its own Black consciousness movement. As mentioned before, Steve Biko was the father of Black consciousness in South Africa in the 1970s. But we also see in recent years the emergence of movements such as Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, which can also which were geared towards decolonizing education and access to education in South Africa, but can also draw parallels with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States of America. Further, there are many parallels that can be drawn between South Africa's history, colonial and apartheid history, as well as the United States civil rights history. We are very privileged to be able to engage with people like Mr. Lionel Davis, who fought against the apartheid state firsthand and was, of course, imprisoned on Robben Island for his work and involvement in the National Liberation Front. Stories like Mr. Davis's help us to process the social and political struggles that we are going through in our current context. It also opens doors for us to speak about things like race, privilege, and inequality, which we hope you'll feel safe to do in this session. We ask again that you post any meaningful questions and comments that you have using the Q&A tool throughout the session, and these will be presented to Mr. Davis. Before we get to our conversation with Mr. Davis, let us be orientated to Robben Island.
To cope with the increasing resistance to apartheid and growing number of political prisoners, work started on a new prison in 1962. Like the Dutch occupiers in the 1600s, prison labor was used to build the jail. When completed, the Robben Island Maximum Security Prison became the most feared prison in South Africa. In the words of Oliver Tambo, it was the most inhospitable outpost of apartheid. Day-to-day prison life was grueling. Prisoners were kept in isolation cells and made to sleep on the floors and also in larger communal cells. Work on the island up until the mid-70s mainly consisted of hard labor, breaking stones in the prison yards or in the quarries. This limestone quarry is probably the most famous quarry in the world. Its workforce included many of our future leadership who spent years digging limestone under searing heat and blinding sun. All of the prisoners who worked here developed permanent damage to their eyes. A small cave at the back of the quarry provided some relief. It was used as shelter, a resting place, and parliament for some of the future leaders of South Africa.
Further to that, we of course encourage you to visit the Google Arts and Culture platform, which offers a narrated virtual tour of Robben Island. And we'll share a link to that in the chat. But for now, let us go to our conversation with the ever so wonderful Mr. Lionel Davis. Mr. Davis, please take it away.
Hi. I can't see your eyes.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you see now? I'm looking at you.
Okay,
I can see
good.
you. You can go ahead.
Wonderful. That's good
Thank
enough.
you.
So what happens now? Are you going to be questioning me, interrogating me?
I'm not going to be questioning you. You can tell us your story and we will listen silently. And then we will ask you our questions at the end.
Thank you for showing me facets of Robben Island, because I spent many years there. We people are now talking about Black Lives Matter, and it's a powerful movement in the United States at the moment. My introduction to the atrocities of apartheid started as a child. I grew up in the municipal district known as District 6, and most of its inhabitants were impoverished people of color. One thinks of District 6, and of course, when the Dutch came, the indigenous people, the Khoisan, were forcefully removed from the land, and they had to flee. They were murdered. They were killed off. And thereafter, your Dutch settlers and those of European origin, starting in 1652, started occupying that land between Table Mountain and the seashore. That area became known as District 6. By the time of my birth, District 6 was a home for people of European descent, whether they were Portuguese, whether they were Dutch, German, French. And they started cultivating the land there because indigenous people had already been removed from the land. But gradually, others started moving in there too. At the time of the emancipation of slaves, or just post that period, many people who had gained their freedom as slaves, some of them moved into District 6. You had indentured laborers from China and India also decided not to go back to their homeland. They moved into District 6. You then had people from West Africa, East Africa, all moving in, Southern Africa, all moving into District 6. So by the time of my birth, you had this very mixed population. A huge percentage of these people living in District 6 came from Eastern Europe, primarily of Jewish origin. And they, of course, were seen as white. They were classified as white by not only by the Dutch, but later by the apartheid regime. They came from oppression and started oppressing the indigenous people, the black people of South Africa. They were able, because of economic opportunity, to enrich themselves. They owned the houses in District 6. The greater percentage of the homes in District 6 at the time of my birth was owned by these white people, especially by the Jewish population. So we had this mixed community. And although we lived cheek by jowl in this community, it was whites who was seen as right, bright, beautiful. Everything that they wanted, they got. We were seen of lesser importance. Now, growing up in District 6 under very, very poor conditions, my mother was just a factory worker. I had 2 other siblings older than me, lived in a very, very tiny little room, no facilities. We had, if we wanted to go, other tenants were also in this house, a double-story tenement building. And we could not, because there were Muslim people downstairs, we were living upstairs. We could not traipse in and out of their domain, going to the toilets. So I used to pee in a paraffin tin upstairs, and in the morning we had to go and empty it. I had to wash in a paraffin tin. That's what was available to us. My home was the street because there was no comfort at home. My home became the street. That's where I spent my time. I had a job then. At the age of 12, I had a job. My job was to make certain that I go and buy groceries, little things that we needed. It was a time when people did not own fridges, electric stoves, and the like. Goods were perishable. So I go. It was my job to go do the shopping, buy bits of oil, butter, cheese, eggs, and so forth. And on a particular day at the age of 12, I go to the shop. The owner, a Jewish man, is standing at the curbside in front of his shop, watching what was going on in the street. I pass by him. He's got his back to me. I go into his shop. When he turns around later, he sees this little black boy standing there. And the first thing that comes to his mind is that I had sneaked in to steal. I had a little bag with me. He insisted on looking into that bag. I had only come to buy eggs. And I refused to hand him the bag. Eventually, I gave him the bag, but I had bought the eggs. There was nothing in the bag. But he didn't have the decency to apologize to me. That infuriated me. I grabbed one of the eggs and I launched it at his head. I missed. And the egg splashed against his display windows, and I ran because he would have clobbered me. When I look back at my life, this is what I experienced. This is what made me want to understand what was happening in this country of mine that I did not know. And as I grew older, I had many confrontations with white authority. The police, bus conductors, train drivers, whoever was white, even when I was working as a teenager for a printing company, I had confrontations with white authority. And some of these white office workers called me cheeky. They called me all sorts of derogatory names because I did not want to bow down to their authority. I was arrested at one time when working for this company. We had gone to the shops. It was lunchtime. I was just working as a lorry guard. And a fellow worker had gone into the shop to buy bread. I was wondering why it took him so long. So I went to see what was happening. The Portuguese owner was having a major argument with this man, semi-literate, because he did not want to pay more for the bread. I tried to intervene to explain, and this woman took her fury out on me. Started hitting me in the face. I lifted up my hands just to cover my face. And she then reported, I was 18 years old, she reported me to the police that I had physically assaulted her. Now, I did not have the money. I did not know the law. Had no money to even think in terms of a lawyer. I was arrested. And I was sentenced to a caning. They strap you down and they beat you with a bamboo cane that had been soaking in salt water. I had 7 strokes. And for years, I could see those marks on my backside. Took many years to heal. But this is what made me want to do something about my lot. It spurred me on to go to political meetings, whether it was the PAC, whether it was the ANC, that did not matter which organization it was. I wanted to know what was happening in my country. Also started going to night school because I realized that I was not getting anywhere. My education was not adequate for me to make improvement. I went to night school. It must have been in the late 1950s. Didn't get far because it had no meaning for me really. But in 1960, we were still staying in District 6. It's when I heard about the protest march of the PAC. Living near the police station, I heard these vehicles, trucks, police trucks, moving in. And it's not far from our home. And I decided to go and see what was happening. It stirred me. A white policeman in fatigues saw me standing there. And to him, I was just another one of those guys who were protesting, and he passed by me and took his wooden baton and hit me across my shins. In agony, I bent down. These are the things that stirred me to want to know more. And that is why I started going to political meetings. I wanted to know. I joined the African People's Democratic Union of South Africa. I was at night school when I made contact with these people. And I had started attending their political meetings. They had the most wonderful theoretical knowledge, but they didn't have the ability to reach the masses of the people. I was then introduced to people like late Dr. Neville Alexander, the late Fikile Bam and others, who were members of Abdusa, but decided to form the National Liberation Front. The aim was that one day we would take up arms against the apartheid government. I joined them. We started meeting clandestinely, but we were too inexperienced to cover our tracks. It was to be secret meetings. But because of our ignorance, we recruited the wrong peoples, and they were the ones to alert the security police. We were all arrested. 11 of us or more were arrested and placed under 90-day detention, where they would interrogate you. One of the people in our organization was the late Dulcie September, who after her period in jail and house arrest joined the ANC, and she was assassinated, executed in Paris. But what the most important thing for me is that we were sentenced. The women went to another jail, 4 women, 7 men went to Robben Island. I came from a very divided society. We were divided into Asiatic, to colored, into Bantu. We had so many different, and of course then they're white. On Robben Island, there were no white prisoners. The biggest mistake that the apartheid government made, whereas in civil society, they divided us into so many different categories. They had the power to do that. You grow up with bad education, bad opportunities for work, for improvement in your life, because of these many different categories that they had placed us in. You grow up being antagonistic to your own brothers and sisters in South Africa. For the first time in my life, I learned to live with fellow South Africans. They threw us all together. They discriminated on the basis of giving Asiatics and coloreds better food and clothing than their brothers. When I got to jail, I saw Mandela wearing sandals and a short pants. Me, as black as Mandela with the same forefathers, I was classified as colored. So I was given a long pants, shoes, and socks, shirt, jacket, and a hat. Mandela had to wear a short pants and a little face-like cap. Same applied to food. But the mistake that they made was they threw us together. There were no whites on Robben Island, only people of color, only men. For the first time in my life, I was living with fellow South Africans in the same cell. And what we realized is that we had a common enemy. We may have different politically, but our objective was to survive prison. And the only way we could survive prison was learning to stand together. We went on hunger strikes together, wanting to improve the conditions on Robben Island, better food, better clothing. With time, yes, we achieved much. Most of my 7 years I spent in that section where Nelson Mandela was kept. I was kept with the Ravonia trialists, leading members of the Pan-Africanist Congress, later Black Consciousness Movement people from the Non-European Unity Movement. All those whom they thought were going to be problematic and had leadership qualities were all shoved into what was known as the B section, single cell section 111 to a cell. The one thing that we did, nobody was allowed to come near us. The food was made in the kitchen and it was then brought to our section. It would then be placed in the passage there that leads to the other sections and that leads to what is known as the B section. We had to collect our food because nobody was allowed to come near us. And we were the ones to share our own food, to dish our own food. And the one thing that we did is that we would choose who was going to serve our food from our own ranks. If you wanted pap, we give you pap. If there were 10 people entitled to bread, we would make certain that 30 people in that business, in that cell, each one would get an equal share of that bread. You get bread today, you will not get tomorrow. These are the things that we learned. We agitated for the right to play sport, for better clothing, for better sleeping accommodation. Because when I went to jail, I had one single rope mat, 3 thin blankets. We were not given underwear, night clothing, a pillow, a sheet. Nope. You rolled up your mat, or part of the mat is rolled up so that you can have a cushion. Floor's cold, 3 thin blankets. You either sleep in your clothing or you take it off, but you're only going to get fresh clothing at the end of that week, working week. But we endured. And with the help of our own people agitating for change, with the help of international communities, like International Red Cross, Amnesty International, the Scandinavian countries, people in America, maybe not the government, university students in America, black and white, who supported our struggle for transformation. Helen Suzman, a woman of Jewish origin, the only woman in parliament, it was an all-white parliament, made it a point of coming to Robben Island to see that we were being treated humanely. It's all of this that helped for the transformation of Robben Island. Our teachers, some people did not have money for education. They made it difficult for you to study. But our teachers came from many different political persuasions. ANC, PAC, Black Consciousness Movement in later years, and others. They were Muslim, they were Christian, they were Hindu. They were of the Jewish faith. These are the people who were your teachers. You learned to respect other people's culture. You learned to speak other people's language. And then eventually we were allowed to play sport. All of this helped to keep our sanity. A man comes to jail when he gets a letter from home once in 6 months. He cannot read it. He has to give it to somebody else to read. He has to depend on somebody else to write a home on his behalf. These were guys who were eager to learn to read and write. You had guys who came there with elementary school education, and after 10 or more years, they left Robben Island with university degrees. There were many of them. Dikhango Seneke, who retired a few years ago, the Deputy Judge President of South Africa, was in high school when he was arrested, served 10 years on Robben Island. And in that 10 years, he completed his standard 10 certificate, started studying at university level, the University of South Africa, obtained 2 degrees in that 10 years. One of the subjects he studied was law. And when he was released, he continued his studies, became a practicing lawyer, and ended up as the Deputy Judge President of South Africa. This is the stories that come from Robben Island. I was a beneficiary of all of that. So that when I was realized, I was still under house arrest. But post my house arrest, I was traumatized. 7 years in jail, 5 years under house arrest. I needed healing. As a child, I loved drawing, had no role model, no tuition, but I loved to draw. During that traumatic experience of mine, I needed healing. And I came across, once my house arrest order was over, I came across an organization named the Community Arts Project. At the age of 41, I received my first formal art lessons. It changed my life. From that point onwards up to now, I have been a practicing artist. I've had major exhibitions. The book that Awakenings talks about 40 years of my art experience. After my release from jail, and with the opening of the Robben Island Museum in 1991, no, I've forgotten what the date was now. I think it was 1997, yes. I went to work there. I was one of the first to go to work there, and I worked there for 10 years, more than 10 years. My wife and my younger son came to join me, and they lived there for almost 10 years. I had the privilege of meeting people that I had been in jail with. The Mlangenis, the Mhlabas, the Mandelas. I met them all again. Most of the people doing time on Robben Island didn't know me. They'd never seen me because I was in that section where Mandela was. Then they would say, hey man, who's this guy? Where does he come from? I've never seen him in jail. Then of course we explained. I learned when I went to university in At the age of 54, I went to study at UCT, University of Cape Town. And I did a visual arts degree. I was forced to write because I had to submit my essays. But that ability to write remained with me. I am a writer today. I'm not a published writer, but I am a writer. And because working on Robben Island through those years, 10 years, talking to people from all over the world, young people especially, school going, I acquired the ability to speak to people. I can say today I'm a public speaker. So this journey of mine has been a most eventful journey. And I do not regret that 7 years that I spent in jail. What I do wish was better was at 5 years. Because in jail, 7 years in jail, I did this friendship with so many people. We laughed together, we cried together, we shared, we stood together. Under house arrest, I was alone. For 5 years, a virtual prisoner in my home. Nobody to talk to at night except my mother. Restrictions as to where I go, how far I can go, when I have to be at home, report to the police. You have a choice when under house arrest. You break your banning order several times, the conditions laid down, you go to jail again. You don't break your banning order, you lose your sanity. I endured. I broke my banning order so many, many times. I was never caught. That's the only way that I could keep my mind free from even committing, suicide or anything like that. But it is making art that healed me. So I have a story to tell, and I write about these things in my memoirs. Hopefully one day I'll publish it. I started writing autobiography, but I found it late because everybody, when they leave Robben Island, is writing a book. Yes, I do write about it, but I write about my daily experiences in life. This is my story. I want to stop at this particular point, and hopefully there are questions you may want to ask me.
Thank you so much, Mr. Davis. I think your story is very inspiring, very emotional, but thank you so much for sharing. What I'll do is ask you a few questions. They might jump around from parts of your story. They won't be in order of the story you told. But I'll start with saying that, of course, the movements that you were part of were instrumental in bringing about the end of apartheid and obviously giving people of color the right to vote. And we see that in the United States, they have their elections coming up, I think, in the next month or so. So our first question for you is, with the upcoming US elections, what encouragement or words of wisdom would you give to young people who are deciding whether or not to vote?
Okay, let's talk about our own government. In 1994, for the first time in my life, I cast my vote. It is something that I had looked forward to for decades. I cast my vote. It was a proud day for me. because I thought, now we are going to fulfill all the things that we've ever wanted in a new South Africa. Yes, I'm happy that I did vote, because changes did take place. So many changes have taken place. The freedom of speech. You could not, during a party, not open your mouth and say anything, because you will go to jail. The press was there. They could talk about what is happening in South Africa, what is happening in the world. We became aware. These were the tools that made us begin to understand which way to go and how to go about it. Our schooling system, apartheid was driven away. So fundamental changes that took place in 26 years. After more than 300 years of oppression, we have been voting for 26 years. You are not going to transform this country in 26 years. It's a long, long slog. But we cannot say that things have not changed fundamentally. Yes, we have a long way to go. But in 26 years, we have achieved so much. I would say to others, go and vote. You may not like Trump because he's not taking you forward, he's taking you backwards. What is the alternative? Vote. And every person whom you support will have an iota of what you really want from life. It's not going to happen overnight. We have been fighting for more than 300 years. It's not going to happen overnight. But every time you vote, is an opportunity to break down that walls that have kept you away. So I would say to them, vote. Because if you don't vote, you're giving that person greater powers. Your silence gives those who rule greater powers to do exactly what they want to do. Take you backwards. Take us back to apartheid days. Do we want to go back that way? No. We have seen change. We are hoping for greater change. But sitting at home and keeping the vote to yourself is not going to be to your benefit. So I tell them, vote. Otherwise, Trump will remain that figure that will push you back and back and back. Thank you. That's all I can say to them.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Very inspiring. I definitely agree with you. One man, one vote. We have another question, two questions from Giselle as well as from Esmeralda, which are quite similar. And they would like for you to please touch on in what ways is racism still alive in South Africa, or how far have we not gone and are we yet to go in terms of moving forward towards this ideal of a non-racial society?
It is just strange to think of it. If you ask any white person today of our age, what was your stance during apartheid? They would tell you, no, we were all anti-apartheid. We wanted the apartheid government to go. But they were not telling the truth, because they were the ones who kept the apartheid government in power. Today, when you, because you have the ability to have the money, you want to go and stay in another part of South Africa, you're on a holiday. And you speak to this person over the phone. They listen to your voice. They say, no, this is the kind of person that you want. Yes, there is a booking for you, come. When you get to that place and they see you are black and suddenly the accommodation that you wanted has been filled. Sorry. You go to a restaurant or a place, a fancy place. You're black, you step in. They start suspecting you. No, you are here for other devious reasons. Why are you here? This is what is happening at this moment in time. I experienced it. I can see the attitude that is facing me. 26 years is not a long time. It has been happening for hundreds of years. Never mind what people say. It's not going to change overnight. But our joy is that we still have the law on our side. We have the ability to speak out, to stand up for what we believe should be. So yeah, it's not going to change. You have neighbors who look at you with great suspicion. You see you're black, they're already clutching their purse because you might be there to steal their money. These are things that are happening. The racism in jobs. The blacker you are, the lesser your chance to get a high-powered job. No. So whites still have this monopoly in terms of advancement in life, education. So it's going to take time, but we don't just sit and say this is God's will. We keep on fighting. And every time we fight, there is going to be a shifting of that barricade. Do I answer your question?
You answered my question. Thank you, Mr. Davis.
Thank you.
Our next question would then be, what advice would you give to this new generation of young activists, both in America and across the globe, in terms of moving against white supremacy?
I just think that the youth have shown, very much like 1976, they are showing us that they are not afraid to stand up for what they believe is right. And I admire them. Peace must fall and other similar movements fighting against what has been. For me, I am proud of them. I just think they must continue with that fight because they are an inspiration for the younger generation. They stop fighting, then we go backward. I'm not saying go pick up a gun and start shooting, but there are ways of reaching people. Me as an art teacher, I loved, I have stopped now because I'm getting too old, but for me it was such a joy to work with young people. It's more than just teaching art, but teaching them to empower themselves, to do things for themselves. Not just open your mouth and you get fed with facts. Making art and making your own little doll with clay and so on. It's yours. It's the kind of inspiration that we wanted from education. Why do you think they never allowed us to do art at school? Because they did not want our brains to be stimulated. So when I teach, whether it's young and old, and I was an art teacher for many years, not government art teacher, community art teacher. That's what I did. In 1982, we went to this major cultural conference in Botswana. People from all over South Africa, and especially those in exile, musicians, writers, dramatists, photographers, we all gathered together. And the call was for us to go back into South Africa and use culture as a weapon of struggle. When we came back from Botswana in 1982, we started a screen printing project at this place called the Community Arts Project. I was one of those to help start that project. And we started printing because the established printing firms would report us to the police. They would not help us. We had to do our own printing, screen printing, anti-apartheid posters, making T-shirts, printing T-shirts. A comrade has died. We commemorate that comrade. We celebrate his life by putting his face on a T-shirt. And when they go to the funeral, they are wearing that T-shirt, proudly, defiantly wearing that T-shirt, telling that person who had died, who had been killed, Abagahle. This is what I did. And I worked on a non-sectarian basis. Whether you are PAC aligned, whether you are ANC aligned, did not matter to me, did not matter to us. We were there to offer a service to the community. We were teaching these young people to do things for themselves, not just rely on us. And that is a way of also empowering young people. Not just talk, do. That's what I would say.
I love that because there's only so much you can talk about until you need to become active and move, you know. Our next question is from Venisera. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And that is, in the past few years, there has been an increase in xenophobic or Afrophobic violence in South Africa. Can you talk a little bit about that and your views on that? And do you feel that apartheid played a role in this? And if so, how? And if not, where is it coming from?
You know, it's strange how people are. If you think in terms of the thousands of Jews who ran away from Eastern Europe because they were being oppressed, incarcerated, not given an opportunity to grow, and they come to South Africa. And suddenly they have this new status. They become the masters. They forget that where they came from. And they start oppressing Black people because now they think they are superior. I just think is that our government, who were the beneficiaries, many of these guys were the beneficiaries of help from African countries. When we fled into Africa, West Africa, East Africa, And these are the people that gave us sanctuary. Now today, we've got nothing. We are still fighting to get something. But we deny the very people who helped us to become, to achieve, to win our battles. So for me, it is sad. When you say Black Lives Matter, not only South African Black Lives Matter means wherever there are Black people that have been oppressed, it matters. So xenophobia, I've seen it in action. But we need the tools to be able to get to these misdirected people. We come from there. Why should we do the same thing to our brethren? So yes, for me, this is painful. And I'm sure we will find the tools, the wherewithal, to change that thinking of our own people here in South Africa. Those are our brothers. In the same way that I found brotherhood and love in jail from people from all over South Africa, people that I'd never lived with before. I learned I was enriched. And this, yes, is my answer to those who are still looking down on other Black people. A Black man looking down on another Black man. For me, it is sad.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I think I would also add to that in the question about how apartheid played a part in this is that xenophobia or Afrophobia in the South African context at least has a lot to do with internalized racism, and that hatred, as you said, of self, and therefore projecting that hatred onto other African people who are more Black maybe than Black South Africans, who encompass this personality of this personality of the personality that is most hated by white people in Blackness. And that internalized racism just manifesting itself.
Yeah, it sits with us. It sits with us. We have all been victims. You can't tell me that the next one has not been a victim. We have all been victimized. But how long do you want to remain a victim?
That being said, our next question and probably last question as we're drawing to the end of our session is, what is the truth about the white farmers being killed in South Africa? And that's from Esmeralda.
Look, let's put it this way. If one thinks in terms of the millions of impoverished Black people, who are trying to find a way, especially now, to feed their families, to overcome the burdens that they are faced with. Yes, you have churches all over. You will have one Black person stealing cattle from another Black person. It happens all the time. A Black person raiding a white farm to steal. It happens all the time. Where there is poverty, you will have these atrocities. If these people had jobs, opportunities. They wouldn't want to go and steal another black man's cattle. It happens. They wouldn't want to go and rob a white farmer. It happens. But those who were privileged yesterday will find fault with every black man. It's as if every black person is a thief. It's like what they look at me when I went into a white area and I go into a shop. They don't even think I'm a bloody old man that said, hey, this one has come to steal again. That's hatred and suspicion. And unfortunately, the press, maybe not our press, but your reactionary press will take the story and turn it around. And these whites who have never done anything for the fellow South Africans, when they get overseas, they want to claim that they are seeking asylum because of black hatred. That's bullshit. Sorry to say so. Because a thief is a thief, and he will steal from anybody at any time. Whether he's black, whether he's white, a thief is a thief.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I think that was a pretty broad answer. Thank you for that.
Don't have the right answers all the time.
Yeah, I understand, definitely. What is something you have learned, or that you learned rather, while being in jail, or something that might have impacted you in any way or form? And that question is coming from Leslie.
I think my greatest education came from my comrades on Robben Island. You know, I said one day to a person, I felt nostalgic when I think of Robben Island. She was so shocked. How can you talk about Robben Island and nostalgia? The experience that I had, not only in education, every facet of my 7 years on Robben Island, was a great learning experience for me. Friendships were made across political lines, something that I had never experienced before. And these guys who were in jail with me, when they see me, whether it was Sisulu, whether it was anybody else, they are happy to see me, the friendships that we made. They would ask me when I meet Sisulu or any of the other guys, how is so-and-so? How is Neville Alexander? What is Les doing? It's that friendship, that contact that I made, that gave me the tools to fashion my post-prison life. So I do not regret the 7 years that I was in jail. I hope I answered that question.
I think you did. Thank you. Our last question is from Elena, and Elena asks, where do you recommend we dedicate our energy and efforts towards issues of social justice?
The issues of?
Social justice.
I can only say, like they said to us in Botswana in 1982, when most of you guys here have had education, most of you guys have the tools. Go back into your communities. If there is no community organization, form a community organization. Take those skills and impart it. When I came from Botswana, when we came from Botswana, we formed a group called Vakalisa, from the word ukuvuka, to wake up. And for about 10 years, we had exhibitions in the townships. We invited poets, we invite musicians, and we would have exhibitions. Every year for almost 10 years, we printed a calendar, a Vakalisa calendar. Poets wrote profound poetry against the status quo. We would put the poem up as if it is a painting, a drawing. We sang, we danced, but we kept the spirit alive. We encouraged others to follow us. Take your skills. See how you can help others to overcome in small ways. You don't have to stand on a platform and shout all the time. Yes, there are those who are good at that. But use the skills that you've got. How can you make a difference to somebody else's life? And when I was working on Robben Island, from the time I was the Robben Island Museum opened, I have spoken to thousands of young people. Tell them, dream. Make your dreams come true. If you fall down, don't just lie down there. Stand up and work for what you want from life. Because I was a beneficiary from that teaching. And that is what I imparted to others. So they can also, yes, stand on your platform, rally with others, but also do something to help uplift others.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. That was a beautiful response. I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's so important for those of us who come out of the education system to go back into our communities and invest what we've learned and the knowledge that we have gained into our communities that have also then invested in us and raised us. So it is important that we go back and raise them as well. But yes, thank you so much, Mr. Davis, once again. Arizona attendees, I would like to say thank you all for your time. I'd like to ask you to join us in thanking Mr. Davis for his time and for sharing his wisdom and his journey with us today by posting words of gratitude in the chat that we will then later on share as well with Mr. Davis. Once again, I'll give you all a moment to do that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have some words coming in, and we've had some words coming in throughout the session. We have Crystal saying, thank you for joining us today. We have Leslie saying, thank you for taking your time and talking to us about your story. We have Carmen who said, thank you, Mr. Davis. Elena who says, thank you for your wisdom, much appreciated. Sam who says, thank you for opening our eyes to the injustices you've experienced. And Ariada who says, thank you so much for sharing your experience. I value your words of encouragement and that you are an inspiration. Thank you all for sharing your words of gratitude with us. I'd like to say thank you from EDU Africa, from Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you so much for having taken the time to join us today. We trust that this has been a very rewarding conversation and that you are feeling inspired to step up as the next generation of leaders and activists to address issues such as racial inequality and social injustice in general, not only in your own country, but as global citizens across the globe. As the elections draw nearer in your own home countries, we encourage you to take the opportunity to learn all that you can, consume all the knowledge that you can, because knowledge is power, and make your vote count. One man, one vote. You can be the difference. Once again, thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Davis, once again as well. Have a good evening or day.
Thank you.
Afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for having me.
And thank you again for EDU Africa and your team, Resejo and Mr. Lionel Davis. We really appreciate your words, and it really hits home to what we're experiencing here in the US. We really value your story, and we really want to kind of put your words into action. And the best that we can do here in the United States with the election coming up is what you said, is to vote. So I encourage you all to get out there and vote and let your voice be heard. And just some housekeeping things that we're doing here with GEL Global Experiential Learning is that we'll be sending everybody an evaluation of seeing how you like this presentation and how it impacted you, kind of like the words that were given on this chat. And we want to thank Student Services Fee for supporting this, as well as the Office of Multicultural Advancement, our team that we work for here. So this will be recorded. So if you want to share this with any of your peers or any of your faculty and staff, it'll be on our website. And please look forward to our series, our GEL virtual series that's coming up in the next few months. There's gonna be 3 different events just like this coming up. And the next one, it will be the last week of October. So please look forward to that. And we really value the conversation, and we hope that this knowledge that you say, Resejo, really kind of infuses within your persons and in your soul, so you can make a difference in the future, not only in your community here in Tucson, but all over the world as well. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Daddy.
This is
Thank
where
you.
we say goodbye.
Yep.